I want to talk a little bit here about this music that you were such an important part of during the 60s, which was then labeled as avant garde music. Before we go into that, Willard, could you like paint a portrait of the jazz scene at that time in terms of the division because of this avant garde music?
Well, you know, we've seen through the years that certain developments in the music are put down or oppressed or depressed or whatever the case may be, because people tend to cling to the old ways of doing things. And that was the case when people like Archie Shepp came along after John Coltrane had made his initial breakthroughs. And you know, even before that, what Cecil Taylor and others were doing were making certain breakthroughs. And so that lack of understanding, along with the fact that these musicians were expressing their sense of being black in America. And so you couple that with the fact that for some people the music they were making apparently was difficult for them to comprehend versus what was the mainstream at the time. And so, you know, it's obvious that people like Archie and his contemporaries were going to have a difficult time breaking through.
Archie, what was it like back then? All the opposition to your music. How did you deal with that?
Well, I wanted to tell a little anecdote that was related by Duke Ellington in his book, his biography, Music is My Mistress. He recounts the story of, I think it was Charlie Mingus, who wrote him or had asked him, Duke, why don't we do something avant-garde? And Duke said, oh, Charles, let's not go back to that.
Right. Like that had never happened before, right?
Yeah, like that. Avant-garde is a kind of term that comes up every generation, and I mean, be it Stravinsky or Eric Satie or whoever. I mean, it could be a great composer, or it could be someone like myself, who's working in another area altogether. That, for example, now they call me a veteran of the avant-garde.
Exactly. So how long does one stay avant-garde?
How long does that last?
I've heard Richard Abrams talk about that. He's laughed and said, yeah, you know, I've been considered avant-garde for the last 50 years. I mean, come on. How long does that last?
Yeah, how about it? You know, and then ultimately, what does it mean? I mean, at a certain point, Louis Armstrong, when he recorded the West End Blues, that was with Earl Hines. That was a very radical piece of music. Hines playing a piano, not stride piano, a piano which is very much has had a lot of influence on how piano is played today. 6/4 chords, giving a greater role to the bass in terms of keeping the rhythm. So I'm saying that the avant-garde has, we could assign that label to a number of epochs, a number of musicians. Roy Eldridge, at a certain point, was radically different from anything that Armstrong had played, and he seems to have exerted a very powerful influence on Dizzy Gillespie.
Absolutely.
Yeah, whereas musicians who came before Dizzy were frequently influenced by pops. I never thought of myself as an avant-garde musician. I think of myself as one of the blues people. I'm a blues.
When you first got to New York, who were some of the musicians that you started affiliating with right away?
Oh, well, there weren't so many that were well known. Most of them were guys who were because eventually I moved to New York when I was 20, and I went to college in Vermont. So when I would come back from college on vacations from Goddard College, I would stay with my aunt in Harlem. So frequently I went to the sessions up at Count Basie's, which is on the 25th and 7th. Now it's Malcolm X Boulevard or something.
Right.
Yeah, and there at that time, you'd be surprised with guys like Horace Parlin used to show up, Freddie Hubbard, Rocky Boyd, who was a very fine tenor player, played something a little like Coltrane. There were many saxophonists at that time who, after Coltrane started playing with Miles, he changed the whole sound of the saxophone. I mean, there were so many new saxophonists coming on the scene with a sound very much like Coltrane. Rocky Boyd, was the guy I mentioned, he died at a very young age. He was a very fine tenor player who played in the style of Coltrane. He was well known around Basie. He used to come to the jam sessions. I could mention a number of really fine musicians who because it was a very rich period for music. And some of those guys, like Freddie, for example, Freddie didn't really have a gig at that time. He eventually started working, I believe, with Charlie Mingus. That might have been his first really important gig. Guys like George Coleman, Junior Cook. I can remember a session at Small's Paradise many years ago. And I was there at the session to play, but at a certain point, there was this sort of very charismatic moment when George Coleman and Junior Cook, who were the most advanced, probably the most advanced musicians there that day on the set, played, just the two of them played, and with the rhythm section, and all the other guys like me who were still getting their thing together just sat and listened. And I can still remember they played After You've Gone, the two of them. And I wish I had a recording machine because, boy, that was a really magical session. Junior and George hooked up. They really played well for about an hour. But that was possible at sessions at that time, and the jam session was so important. Today things have changed quite a bit. I understand kids go to sessions; they have to pay to play, and I mean it's altogether different from the way things used to be.